Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, President Trump has invoked a centuries-old law to help speed up mass deportations.
I think we're on very dangerous ground here. This is as lawless an action as the administration has taken.
How the Trump administration's latest actions affect migrants, permanent residents, and even citizens in the United States. I'm Kevin Hurton, and this is The Take.
My name is Pablo Manriquez. I was born in Chile to a Chilean father and a mother from St. Louis, Missouri. They were both exiled basically by Pinochet. I ended up growing up in Missouri. I always not only wanted to be a reporter, but I wanted to be a reporter to cover Congress. So fast forward to now, we launched Migrant Insider, and we've had our finger on the pulse, especially of the policy changes coming out of Washington.
Wow. So right place at the right time. Well, let's get into it. So, Pablo, Trump's immigration crackdown has been, quite frightening, not just for immigrants and refugees to the United States, but even for U.S. citizens. This past weekend, we saw things escalate even farther when Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act.
President Trump has invoked a wartime law known as the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 to help speed up.
Now, he used it to send Venezuelans from the United States to El Salvador, even after a federal judge essentially told him not to. So if you could start us off by just walking us through the basics of what happened for anyone who may have missed it.
Over the weekend, the ACLU filed suit about a flight that was about to leave for El Salvador from the United States full of Venezuelan detainees. The flight took off anyway, and while it was in the air, Judge Boasberg ordered it returned. The flight did not return. The flight ended up landing in El Salvador, where the detainees were taken out in a big production by the El Salvador government. So now there's a question of what are the consequences for not obeying this judge's order. Trump has suggested that the judge should be impeached, and Justice Roberts in the Supreme Court said that this is inappropriate. We shouldn't be impeaching judges for doing their job. So that kind of brings us up to where we are right now.
So let's try to break this down piece by piece, starting with who was deported. Trump is accusing them of being part of a specific gang, Tren Aragua. Now, some of their lawyers, including the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU attorney Lee Gallant, says that's not true.
What we understand is that many of the people, including our named plaintiffs, are not members of the gang. So for that reason alone, this is illegal.
This is what Trump said.
I can tell you this, these were bad people. That was a bad group of, as I say, hombres. That was a bad group. When you look at them and you look at the crimes that they've committed, you take a look. You don't get any tougher. You don't get worse than that.
Some aren't in gangs. Some aren't even criminals. So who are these people? And why is Trump so set on sending them away, Pablo?
Well, it's unclear so far with the detainees that got sent to El Salvador, who they are, because we have absolutely no access to them. But for the last group of detainees that they said somewhere controversial, which was Guantanamo, we found that the one through line was A, they were male, B, they were Venezuelan, and C, they had tattoos either above the neckline or below the sleeves. We think that they were just picking people with tattoos for a photo op on the tarmac, because when we interviewed these guys and when we interviewed their mothers and their sisters and so on about who they were, they had certified documents from the countries that they were from that said they had no criminal background. And some of these guys had never even set foot into the United States as free men. They never even had a chance to commit crimes in the United States. And yet the Trump administration have been adamant that these are gang members, these are violent criminals.
The president did the right thing. I stand by it. I thought we removed in one day over 200 dangerous people, including MS-13.
And as you saw this past weekend, the president used his authority under the Alien Enemies Act to deport foreign terrorists. Tren de Aragua is now a designated foreign terrorist organization.
So it for the life of me, it just doesn't make any sense.
Wow.
Why they wouldn't just detain and deport actual violent criminals. But we did a lot of reporting on this over the last few weeks, and we have yet to find any violent criminals or people with established gang ties amongst the detainee populations who have been so high profile going either to Guantanamo or El Salvador. And the federal government has yet to prove a single detainee has these gang ties or these violent criminal backgrounds.
Okay, the Alien Enemies Act from 1798. This law is pretty notorious. In fact, it's the law that was used to unlawfully detain tens of thousands of Japanese during World War II. That's something Congress has actually apologized for since. So here's the question. The president already has pretty broad authority to detain and deport people who aren't here lawfully. Why is Trump reaching back to a law passed in the 18th century here?
The Alien Enemies Act of 1798 was one of 4 immigration bills that got passed by President John Adams. This is when Congress was still in Philadelphia. And one thing you got to recognize about Trump and how he does things is that the flourish of a policy action is something that's very important to him. So the idea of if it's good enough for John Adams, it's good enough for Trump kind of thing. You know, the idea of like Trump blowing the dust off this old statute at the Resolute desk and saying, this is what we're going to do. It appeals to his base. It's a narrative that he's very good at selling. Now, the question of whether or not the Alien Enemies Act applies to 2025 is one that is going to be decided in the courts. My initial reaction, personally, as somebody who covers this all the time, is that it is not going to have standing in the court. The Alien Enemies Act is for a wartime president and a authority of deportation, of detention, right? We're not in a wartime. Now, what the administration wants to say is that we're experiencing an invasion. And so that's the same as what John Adams was kind of dealing with the French in 1798. It's unlikely that the court finds that they're standing for that. But by invoking this ancient act to do it, they're basically saying, you know, we are willing to go as far back into the legal code as necessary to find some excuse that some judge is going to allow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where this test is going to be. More with Pablo after the break. Okay, let's talk about where these planes landed. Some are saying this shouldn't even be called a deportation because they aren't going back to their home country. They're going to El Salvador, and specifically this supermax security prison in El Salvador. The images of this place are pretty scary. Talk about this end of the story. What's in it for El Salvador? What's in it for Trump?
Cash. Bukele is the president of El Salvador. He wants money. He has put a lot of his country's economy into crypto, and it has not worked out well for his country's economy. But his claim to fame throughout the region was in taking this gang-ridden country and just incarcerating millions of people, right? El Salvador is taking $6 million from the United States to detain migrants. But he's created a detention state that people like Marco Rubio, that a lot of these people on the far right who are supporters of Trump have embraced. So Marco Rubio went down one of his first official trips as Secretary of State was to El Salvador, where he had this conversation with Bukele. Can you detain migrants from the United States in your country? Bukele says, sure, we could do it for cash. According to reports, Stephen Miller and his office, his deputy chief of staff for policy, said, no, the flights need to keep going. And the flights ended up landing. And they landed with a lot of fanfare. There was drone shots at the airport. There was, photographers waiting to see these guys taken out of the planes. So the arrival of Venezuelan detainees from the United States under the auspices of gang membership, right? It's just another, let's throw the gang members into these supermax facilities. There's no one who claims that these things are compliant with any code of human rights in the world.
Yeah.
The lights are on all the time. They're crowded in there. I don't know if you've seen photos of these things, but these guys are always in their underwear and Crocs. It's horrible conditions. Venezuelans have become the front line, experiment in this. So where they're sending them is really hell on earth. And it's also, it creates these incredible challenges for people like Legal Alert from the ACLU. How do you call an inmate detainee in El Salvador? What rights does he have? Is he still a detainee of the United States? Have we outsourced this capacity to an offsite facility that we have any jurisdiction over? Or are we just dumping them there, right?
Yeah.
What pressure does that put on the Venezuelan government to start taking these detainees so that they don't end up in El Salvador and supermax prisons? And who else are they going to start sending to El Salvador and supermax prisons? Is it going to be like Mahmoud Khalil or some of these other detainees who are legal permanent residents who don't have gang ties or anything like that? But because Marco Rubio thinks that they are a national security threat, are they going to end up at Guantanamo? Are they going to end up at El Salvador? These are the kind of questions that people are asking. It's a whole other thing to say you could disappear to an El Salvadoran supermax prison where no one has any access to you from here on out.
if the Trump administration could just load people onto planes and the second they're over international waters, they're gone. There's no recourse. That means that they just need to do things in secret. They can get you over international waters and then people are just out of the country and inaccessible. So it does matter like when the actual order was issued and when they received it, doesn't it?
Yes. And plus, like, this is an American plane. The American taxpayer pays for these assets. So the notion that just because it's over international waters, suddenly it doesn't have any jurisdiction in the United States seems absurd to me. Like, we haven't spent the last 80 years developing our power in the hemisphere to say that, like, well, once we're over the Mexican border, it becomes a Mexican issue, or once we're over, like, once we're flying over Venezuela, it becomes a Venezuela issue. That's crazy. That is a ceding of power that no one in the Defense Department is going to go for. Like, if you're in an American plane, especially a military plane, then of course you're still in American jurisdiction. It doesn't make any sense. The question is, what is going to be required to bring these guys back to the United States so we can hear their testimony? Because the testimony we're hearing out of the guys that went to Guantanamo have since been deported to Venezuela is horrific. And I can't imagine what these Venezuelans who are now just in the general population of El Salvador and Supermax prison are going through. But I think that we will find out because, law matters. You know what I mean? And if not, then all is lost, because if the Trump administration could just take anybody they want and put them out over international waters, well, I mean, I was born in Chile under Pinochet, and I know what they did to people when they took them out over international waters in the Pinochet regime. They would just throw them out the helicopter, right? So is Trump allowed to do that because there's no court, because the court can't say otherwise? Because, that is basically what they're suggesting, that once we leave the jurisdictional parameters of our own borders in a plane, that all law is off. Like the judge has no say in it. The courts have no say in it. And that's just ridiculous.
But it's worth pointing out. So he uses this novel approach, the 1798 law. A judge says, hold on, let's put a stay on this. Doesn't even rule, just puts a stay on it. And then Trump calls for impeaching the judge for doing so. And then in a rare moment, conservative Supreme Court Justice John Roberts, the Chief Justice, rebukes Trump's call for impeachment in favor of the courts and in favor of due process. So now you have this clash between Roberts, this old guard conservative, and then Trump over whether Trump should essentially be able to do whatever he wants. You're there on Capitol Hill. How wary are people of where this could be headed, this clash?
Honestly, when it comes to immigration, Republicans who have the majority in both the House and Senate have been completely deferential to Trump. A great example of this, we asked about 30 Republican senators, whether or not they support ICE raids on churches. Now, they consider themselves old school conservatives. These are Christians, and they're saying basically like, yeah, I mean, of course we could have ICE raids in churches. Now, this will change as we go moving forward toward the election. This will change as deportations become increasingly unpopular. But for the moment, it's open season on immigrants. The president promised during his campaign that he was going to harm immigrants. The Democrats had no backstop, no counter position about helping immigrants. So now it's just open season on immigrants and policy. What's happening in Capitol Hill right now is that everybody is talking about funding the deportation force that has been a floundering effort so far.
So, Pablo, you cover immigration for a living, and this is a country of immigrants. And at the moment, things seem to be going one way, this crackdown, this hatred of immigrants. But do you think that there could be a backlash at some point, that America might change tracks at all, and that there's reason to be hopeful?
I think absolutely there will be moments where people pay attention, and in paying attention, they take to the streets. And when they take to the streets, they'll make clear that immigrants are not alone and that people are willing to back their friends and neighbors. The deportation apocalypse that was promised on the campaign trail ultimately is not what people signed up for in voting for Trump. People are paying attention to immigration right now in a way that they didn't when Biden was president, the way that they don't when Democrats are president generally. And when they pay attention, it creates this ecosystem of, as a reporter, you see our colleagues who are suddenly learning how to use like the online detainee locator system and stuff like that. We're starting to think about these people as individuals instead of just numbers on a chart. So if there is a moment of hope, the question is like, when this presidency is over, how to maintain that that attention and that focus on doing the work and on, making the immigration be something that is sustainable. But what happens when the Trump presidency is over? Like, how do you keep people's attention? Because some of the most throat-cutting policy decisions of the last 10 years have happened quietly under Democrats. Nobody really covered them. So I think if there's one thing hopeful, it's that people in our profession are starting to take the immigration beat seriously. And I would say B, and this is an even bigger deal, the allies that immigrants have are starting to come out already. It's early in the presidency, and you can see in the marches, you can see in the press conferences, you can see in some of these lawsuits that are being filed that citizen allies are really coming out in earnest, and they're coming out early. And that to me is incredibly hopeful because, the only way that migrants are going to survive this in this country is if citizen allies, people who don't have the liability of deportation, who don't have the liability of immigration detention, are out in the streets, sounding the alarm for them and having their back.
And that's the take. While you're here, let us know what else you think we should be covering. Just write a note down below in the comments and we will read them. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button and keep following every single episode. We'll be back tomorrow.